Wonderful. If you have a Bible, do get it out or switch it on. And we're going to read from Luke chapter 1, verses 26 to 38. It will also appear on the screen. But we're going to read this before we do anything else. In the 6th month, God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a town in Galilee, to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of David. The virgin's name was Mary. The angel went to her and said, "Greetings, you who are highly favored. The Lord is with you." Mary was greatly troubled at his words and wondered what kind of greeting this might be. But the angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary. You have found favor with God. You will be with child and give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever. His kingdom will never end." "How will this be?" Mary asked the angel, "since I'm a virgin?" The angel answered, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. So the Holy One to be born will be called the Son of God. Even Elizabeth, your relative, is going to have a child in her old age. And she who is said to be barren is in her 6th month, for nothing is impossible with God." "I am the Lord's servant," Mary answered. "May it be to me as you have said." Then the angel left her. Now, I don't know about you, but perhaps it feels a little strange to be hearing this passage in the middle of summer. So I'm standing here in my summer dress and my flip-flops. It's perhaps not the season for it, but there are some wonderful truths that we can glean from it as we look at it today. I wonder what images come to mind when you think of Mary. When I Googled it, when I typed in Mary to Google, there were many photos of the Virgin Mary as described in this passage, but about number 6 on the list was in fact Mary Berry. That's not the Mary we're talking about tonight. Perhaps these images are more what we think of. A blue dress, images of a serene lady with a halo above her head cradling a baby. A sought-after role in the Christmas nativity. I always dreamt as a child that I would be Mary in a school nativity, and I never was. I was always the icicle or some other part which was just made up to make me feel included. Not really sure where the icicle features, but there are photo evidence of that. It wasn't actually until we arrived at St Mike's a few years ago, and my husband and I walked in with our 14-month-old child, and we were thrown a load of costumes for the nativity service, and they said, "Everybody's dressing up, there'll be loads of Marys, there'll be loads of Josephs, you don't need to worry, just stick it on and join the crowd." So we did that. Turned out when they called Mary onto the stage, there was only one, and that was me. And then when they called Joseph, there was only one, and that was David, and it was the biggest baby Jesus ever, as Josiah was 14 months. But there we were, the kind of centre of the nativity a few years ago, and all we wanted to do was the ground to swallow us up. Those hopes for being Mary wasn't quite what I imagined, really. But there we go, I was Mary once. But, unlike some of the other characters in this series that we've been looking at in the evening service, we may well feel like we know Mary. Perhaps we've heard this passage read countless times at carol services and at nativities. It's so familiar in lots of ways. But as we were putting this series together, we felt Mary had to be included because she has such a lot to teach us about what a life surrendered to the Lord looks like. So what can we learn from Mary? A couple of things. I think the first one is her ordinariness. Seems a strange description for one of the most famous people in history. Mary is a pretty big name. She's got buildings and even cities named after her. She's the subject of literature, music, art, and many prayers. She's got feast days dedicated to her, shrines built to her, stained glass windows feature her face across the globe. She's held up as an example of holiness and obedience to the Lord. She seems anything but ordinary. And yet, it was in the ordinary that it all began. There was nothing obviously special about Mary, a teenage girl waiting for her wedding day. She was from a poor background. She was almost certainly uneducated, and she came from a pretty rough place called Nazareth. At another point in the Gospels, we hear when Jesus arrives, Nazareth, what good can come from there? This wasn't a great place to be born. There was nothing significant about Mary's life. She was very ordinary. And then one day, an angel comes to her. We read in verse 28 of our passage that this angel went to her and says, "Greetings, you who are highly favored. The Lord is with you." And we're told as this great angel comes and delivers these words to her that Mary was greatly troubled. I sometimes read that and I think that's probably a bit of an understatement. I can't imagine what that would have been like. But to help bring some sense to it, some kind of explanation, the angel goes on to tell her what it will be. You're going to give birth to the one who will reign over the house of Jacob. His kingdom's never going to end. All these amazing promises. Just imagine for a moment being told all that. It is utterly enormous. Mary could very legitimately have answered, "You've picked the wrong person, you're in the wrong town, I'm unqualified, I'm poor, and if you hadn't noticed, I'm a woman. I'm barely allowed into the temple to worship God, let alone carry him inside my body. Surely there are more suitable candidates for the job." And yet, this is who God chooses to bestow his favor upon. This is who God chooses to use. And we see it time and time again throughout scripture and history that the people God uses to advance his kingdom are not often the most impressive. They're not always the most qualified. They don't have the greatest CV and credentials. They don't often come with a glowing reference. But in his grace and through his power at work, these unlikely candidates are used to build God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. And I think the key to God's choosing of Mary is found at the end of verse 28. "Greetings, you who are highly favored," and it's these words, "The Lord is with you." The Lord is with you. This was what made all the difference in the world. In these days before Jesus was born, God's Spirit met specific people at specific times in specific ways to do specific jobs. But following the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, the promise that was for those specific people becomes a promise for all people who put their trust in God. God isn't some distant deity telling us what to do from afar. He promises to be with us by his Spirit. And that makes the difference between the ordinary and the extraordinary. Mary bore God in her body, the Son of God physically dwelling inside of her. But by God's Spirit, we bear God in our bodies. The Lord is with us. we get to experience the favor of the Lord. And it's not about being qualified or educated or having the right background. What transforms the ordinary into the extraordinary is the presence of the living God dwelling inside of us by his Holy Spirit. And when the Lord is with us, when we choose to let him into our lives, we experience the favor of the Lord as we become children of the living God. And that label, child of God, son of God, daughter of God, is far more powerful than how others view us, or our limitations, or our occupations. And it's out of that place of being a child of God, of having God with us, that he can use us to fulfill his plans and purposes. And that has definitely been my experience as I found myself on a journey to this place here. And I want to make really clear, that following God's call does not mean working for a church or for a Christian charity or organization. You will all have your own stories, but this is my story. For a very long time, a lot of people over many years said to me, Ellie, when are you going to get ordained? Ellie, when are you going to, get collared? All the things that people would come and say to me from quite a young age. And they knew that my godmother was one of the first women to be ordained back in 94. And so they'd be like, oh, go on, you're going to follow in Joy's footsteps. And my response was always, no way. I'm not vicary enough. I don't look like a vicar. I'm not clever enough. I'm not serious enough. I don't feel like, I can do this thing. I don't feel like I can carry the weight of responsibility. That was the kind of answer that I would give. And to top it all, I longed to get married and to have children, and I had absolutely no idea how that would all fit together. I counted myself out. I could never do it. A couple of weeks ago, Hannah talked, as she was talking about Deborah, about imposter syndrome. That so often we can count ourselves out because we think we're not good enough. We don't fit the mold. Somebody else will do a better job. And that was absolutely my story. But eventually, and I'll go into more detail in a moment as to what the turning point was, I said yes to God. And yesterday was ordained priest in his church. And it wasn't because of me, but because of him as he's faithfully led and guided me. As we meet Mary in these verses, I am struck and I am thankful for her ordinariness. But I'm also struck by something else. I'm struck by her obedience. I'm sure that this wasn't the first time that Mary said yes to God. Lots is said about how the male disciples left everything to follow Jesus. I've heard countless sermons on the calling of the disciples and how they left their fish and, their jobs and their trades to follow this man called Jesus. But I'm not sure I've ever heard anyone talk about how Mary really was the first one to say yes to him before he'd even been born. Throughout the Old Testament, there have been whisperings and prophecies of God's salvation plan. But if you were God, who would you use to bring that to fulfillment? God chose a teenage girl from Nazareth called Mary. She was the very first person to be told specifically about his coming, and her response is, count me in. If we're talking about the first disciples, surely Mary's name has got to be top of the list. You might have come across a relational tool called the 5 love languages. I wonder if you've heard of that. Well, essentially, it's a tool that helps people to relate to one another well. And the 5 love languages are touch, acts of service, words of affirmation, quality time, and gifts. But I think God's primary love language isn't best described in any of these, although probably in some ways all of them, we'd have to add another category. And I think that category would be obedience. Obedience to himself. This is all God asks of us. It's not to have it all together or to be perfect or to have the right qualifications and to look impressive. God just wants our obedience. Obedience, I think, is the love language of God. But we resist it and we avoid it so often in our culture. We don't like the idea, really, of surrendering our freedom to anyone or anything. We're getting a strong picture on a very small scale in our house at the moment with our 3.5-year-old as he is testing the boundaries in lots of different ways. Josiah, please can you go over there? And he'll sort of get halfway there and look and just see, are you watching? Am I going to do it? Am I not? Am I not? Am I not? And it's this kind of, oh, well, just see if I do it. Or, just various ways in which they're kind of testing the boundaries as we ask him to do things. It's like resisting and pushing against. But I think that that's a bit reflective of our culture. We want to do it our own way. We want to do it in our own time. We don't want to be told what we've got to do, even sometimes if it's harming us. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says these words, "Everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who builds his house on a rock." That's the key. It's not just about knowing what we're being asked to do, but actually doing it. Our 3.5-year-old hears us all too well. There's no problem with his ears. It's the doing it that's the challenge. Obedience is about listening to God's voice and responding to it. Listening to him about how we live out our lives, the decisions we make, the priorities we have, and being willing and ready to change as he leads us and guides us. And we're told in John chapter 10 that as his sheep, we can hear his voice. We're probably not going to hear a booming voice from heaven. We're probably not going to have an angel like Mary did come to us and say greetings, and then give us our instructions. But through his word, which is the primary way that God speaks to us, through one another, through prayer, through waiting on the Lord, through trusted Christian friends and family, through all sorts of ways the Lord speaks to us. So let's get to know him. Let's take time to draw near to him and get to know what he sounds like. Learning to listen to God, I find, is a little bit like tuning in a radio. It's like muffly and kind of jumbled and hard to make out to begin with. But as we tune it in, it becomes crisp and clear. And I think the more we get to know God, the more we get to know his ways, the clearer his voice becomes. And as we fall in love with him, as we experience his love, his kindness, his power, his protection and his peace, it's like we want to do the things he does. We want to choose the things that he chooses. We want to obey. Even, and this is important, even if we don't fully understand. Even if we don't fully understand. And I'm pretty sure that was the case for Mary as she found herself in front of an angel that day. I came across this beautiful translation in the message last week of Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5-6. Trust God from the bottom of your heart. Don't try to figure out everything on your own. Listen for God's voice in everything you do, everywhere you go. He's the one who will keep you on track. Don't assume that you know it all. This call to surrender is even when we don't understand, even when we can't make it out ourselves. For me, that was so true and such a significant part of my story. As you know, all these people have been saying for such a long time, when are you going to get ordained? But it wasn't until 2016 in March, I was at the funeral of somebody who I knew really very well. She was in one of the youth groups in our area where I was a youth worker, and she had died suddenly of cancer. And we were at her funeral in this church in Hertfordshire, this auditorium packed full of people come to mourn and to grieve and try in some way to thank God for her life, but it was ended far too soon. And this vicar, David White, was at the front of the church leading the service. And just as he was preaching, I wasn't thinking about ordination at all. Being ordained was so far from my mind in that moment, but I just sensed the Lord say to me, Ellie, what if I'm calling you to be ordained? Forget everybody else. What if I'm calling you to be ordained? And that just felt so different in that moment because I knew the Lord, and I knew that God was good, and I knew that even though it made no sense to me and I couldn't figure it all out, that if I took a step, then I could trust him, and then I could trust him for the next step and the next step and the next step, and that's kind of how it worked. And at that point, I told my vicar at the time, and he got in touch, and that was the beginning for me of the process, as lots of other things kind of came together that same weekend in 2016. As we think about this call to obedience, I think it's important to remember that we're not being called to obey some harsh, egotistic taskmaster who cares only about himself. No, we're being called to obey the one who created us, who loves us and who died for us so that we might discover life in abundance. That is God's heart for us. So I wonder where we're finding it hard to obey God at the moment. Last week, Susie challenged us so movingly through her own testimony to think about those parts of our lives which we've set off limits. Those parts of our lives where we've said, God, I'll give you this, but this is mine. I wonder what it is for you. And let's be real about this. Obedience is costly. You know, from our vantage point, it's easy to look at Mary and think, well, that all sounds amazing. An angel coming and telling you that you're highly favored, that you're going to be mum to the Son of God. That's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, isn't it? The dream job. But for Mary, that would have felt quite different. You know, we hear this read by children at nativities often. We soften the story. But the truth is, it's not sweet and it's not fuzzy. Mary's obedience to God that day would have cost everything. Her decision to obey risked being cancelled on every level. In a society where everyone knew everything and everyone and talked openly to one another about everybody's business, Mary's bulging tummy would have been a source of shame and disgrace. Though she wasn't married to Joseph, she might as well have been. And in the Jewish culture, being pledged in marriage was basically the done deal. And so for Joseph to hear that his fiancée was pregnant and the child wasn't his would have taken some swallowing. Can you just imagine the conversation? Joseph, I've got some news. I'm pregnant. It's not yours, but it's good news. It's great news. I can't imagine it going down too well. We read in Matthew's account that he decided to divorce her. Fair enough. But she had no idea what would happen. She might have had to raise this child on her own, ostracized from everyone else. By agreeing to this crazy plan, she opened herself up to every kind of risk, and divorce would not have been the only thing on her mind. Adultery carried with it the death penalty. And so if people didn't believe that God had got her pregnant, which, would have been a fair conclusion, her life was on the line, not just her relationship. And as a parent of young children, one of the things that most scares me for Mary is the responsibility of bearing and raising a child. And though they are children of God, my boys are most definitely not the promised Messiah. And all the things that I worry about, oh my goodness, are they choking? Quick, get it out. Is that cough normal? Is that, is this okay? Are they well? Be careful as you cross the road. Going into a crowd of people is terrifying as two little people run in opposite directions. But Mary and Joseph lost Jesus in a crowd for 3 days. Can you imagine how they would have felt? I thought he was with you. This is the Son of God. The weight of responsibility was huge. Not to mention the anguish it would have cost her in so many ways throughout his life as he grew. In Luke chapter 2, the very next chapter, we read how Mary and Joseph take Jesus to the temple to dedicate their son to God. He was just a few days old, and this old guy called Simeon takes Jesus in his arms, and he celebrates that he has seen this child, this long-awaited child, and essentially saying, this is what I've been waiting for. He gives thanks and praise to God. And then as they're marveling away, the new parents, oh, it's so encouraging, this is amazing. He then says this, again in Luke chapter 2. He says, this child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel and to be a sign spoken against, so that the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed and a sword will pierce your own soul too. What? That's not what people normally say about a new baby. I don't know how I'd feel if that was spoken about me as a new parent. And yet this is what Mary's obedience meant. And I cannot begin to imagine the worst of all as she stood at the foot of the cross watching her son be murdered. The greatest agony of being a mother, seeing your precious child suffer. Mary's obedience was costly. She risked punishment of death to bring into the world the one who'd conquer death. She risked shame to bear the one who'd carry our shame. And she risked breaking apart all of her relationships to bring into the world the one who we were designed to be in relationship with. She saw it all. And yet still she utters these words in verse 38. I am the Lord's servant. May it be to me as you have said. I reckon Mary probably had plans for her life. Hopes and dreams that she'd have held on to as a child. But in this moment, she gives it all away to the one who calls her. Why? Because she knew him and she loved him. Often obedience to God feels risky, but I do really believe that it is the path to true security. There's no safer place to be than at the center of God's will, walking in step with him. The world would say that obedience to something or someone is a restriction, a limitation, a loss of freedom. But my personal testimony is that the only way that we'll be truly free is when we bow the knee to Jesus Christ. When we say yes to his yes over us, we find life that is far richer and fuller than anything that this world could bring. And it won't always be easy. It might well come at a cost. It might not make us the most popular, the richest, might not have the greatest status. There's cost to what happened yesterday for me personally. Can say goodbye to free Sundays until we're in our 60s. Diaries don't really match up with our friends and family. The juggle is real with small children, if you don't know that. Have a look at us at the 9 or the 10:30. Time and time again, I felt unqualified, ill-equipped. The imposter syndrome is real. And I've been tempted to give up. But there is nothing that I can imagine doing more than waking up each day and trying as best as I can, and I do not get it right all the time, but to walk in step with the one who I know loves me, who is for me, and has called me his child. In those moments, in those seasons when we, like Mary, feel greatly troubled. I know I did when I went for that first meeting in the Church of England. I think we need to come back to this phrase we talked about at the beginning, the Lord is with you. So what is God calling us to give him tonight? What areas have we set off limits? Where are we clinging on to control? We can bring it to him tonight. We can bring it to him. And he doesn't just demand our obedience. He doesn't stand waiting for us and then says, well done, when we finally do it. No, tonight he's holding out his hand and he wants to walk with us as we take these steps towards him. We do it with him. And it's not a one-moment thing. It's a whole life journey as we choose obedience again and again and again, in the big things, in the small things. I'm sure there were many times along the way that Mary needed to put her hand in Jesus' hand, her hand in the God she loved, and let him lead as she sought to trust and obey. But as she did and as we do, he takes our ordinary obedience and he turns it into something beautiful. When he finds people who are fully surrendered to him, anything is possible. We're going to pray now and have an opportunity to continue to worship the Lord and to respond in whatever way we feel we want to tonight. So can I invite you to stand if you're able to? And those on the prayer team, if you want to come and just make yourselves available as well. Where are we clinging to control tonight? What are we scared to surrender?